Well, according to my watch, and I'm always late, I'm told, I'm going to start right now and welcome you to this evening's Legacy Lecture and Tall Timber event. Susan Henrichs is our guest this evening. And before I introduce her, and we're off and running, please silence your phone or put it in airplane mode if you have it with you. And I want to mention some of the other events taking place tomorrow in this venue up here in the BP Design Theater. It's Movement Magic, Aging Joints, and What We Can Do. I need that, so I may see you here tomorrow evening. And then on Wednesday on the Discover Alaska series, it's herbivores and the structure and function of Alaska's boreal forests. And then on Thursday, the Muskie Pines and South Cushman Social Club will perform music at the Borgeson Botanical Gardens. So lots of great events, and I'm getting some feedback here. Can you hear that? All right. Hopefully our technician, Harper there, can help me with that. But UA acknowledges the Alaska Native nations upon whose ancestral lands our campuses reside. Our Trothiata campus is located on the ancestral lands of the Deneb people of the lower Tanana River. And let me introduce our guest. Born and raised in Anchorage, Susan Henrichs earned a bachelor's degree from the University of Washington and a Ph.D. from the MIT Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution Joint Program. In 1982, Susan returned to Alaska as an assistant professor of chemical oceanography with the Institute of Marine Science, now part of the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences. After over 2 decades as a faculty member, she became dean of the graduate school and vice provost in 2003. She was appointed provost and executive vice chancellor for academic affairs in 2007. Susan retired in 2018 with the title of Provost Emeritus. Both as a volunteer and occasional part-time employee, she has continued to work on behalf of the university with activities ranging from tending pansies with her friend Susan Sagai near Gruening to analyzing UAF's revenues and expenditures. She received the UAF Meritorious Service Award in 2022. Please welcome Susan Henrichs. Well, always with Alaskans, I want to know about your earliest memories. What do you remember from Anchorage, your growing up in Anchorage?
Well, one thing I remember is Anchorage, of course, has changed a very great deal since I was a small child back in those days, and I didn't remember these figures. I looked them up, but I do remember lots of wide open spaces, lots of dirt and gravel roads, lots of wildlife right in the middle of town, and so forth. But looking up the figures, there were fewer than 50,000 people in the Anchorage area in 1958, which was the year of statehood. The whole state had fewer than 225,000 people. So Alaska is still, of course, a land of wide open spaces and many opportunities to get away from it all. But then there were even more so opportunities to be all by yourself in a lot of wide open spaces. I can remember as a child that we ran snow machines in the area which is now called Midtown. And it was a big swamp back in the day, and so you could go for miles and miles and have a great time. I also remember that in 1958, the year of statehood, it's probably one of my earliest memories of an event, because I was 6 years old at that time. And they had a huge bonfire on the Park Strip in downtown Anchorage. And that was one of the first times I think I'd ever been out, as a family at night, doing something. And that bonfire was really pretty impressive. I remember the advertising on the radio for people to, bring everything to put in the bonfire. So there were trees, there was scrap lumber, there was just a huge pile, and certainly for a six-year-old person, it was really impressive.
Huh. Well, and you were there, obviously, for the '64 earthquake. Do you want to share some memories of that?
Yeah, first of all, the area we lived in, which was Spenard, was not severely damaged. It was a neighborhood of trailers and small frame houses, and as the engineers in the audience know, those stand up generally pretty well in earthquakes. I was helping my friend Kim make dinner in her trailer home, and I was 11 at that time, and of course the earthquake hits, and we just spontaneously ran for the door. The trailer was rocking back and forth. It seemed like it might bounce off of its foundation. And we had a lot of trouble getting out the door, though, because the two of us jammed in the door, and then the dog came running through. But we did manage to squeeze out. And then probably the scariest thing during the earthquake itself was the fissures opening up in the ground underneath our feet. And at the time, we didn't know how big they were going to get or what was going to happen. But after the shaking subsided and the fissures stopped opening up, we weren't particularly upset until the people that had been working downtown started coming home. And my dad was driving down 4th Avenue when the earthquake hit, and he saw the side toward the inlet slide away. And the buildings start collapsing, and his response was just to drive faster. And he turned, I guess it must have been 15th Avenue. Anyway, he headed for home, the first turn he could make, and got there, and he was, in panic, really. I mean, of course, he was a pretty contained person. He wasn't, but he was as uptight as I'd ever seen him, because he was expecting the whole neighborhood to be decimated, but really it wasn't that much damage where we were. I had friends, though, that lived in Turnagain, and one girlfriend in particular who rode her house down to the inlet. It slid over the bluff, and she was in it, and she went all the way down. Wasn't hurt. Certainly was, a little shaken up, more than a little shaken up by the experience.
Amazing. Well, you described your parents as frugal and hardworking. How did they come to be in Alaska?
Well, by different paths. My father graduated high school, it was either 1938 or 1939, and it was still kind of the end of the Depression. There were not many job opportunities. The only one that he really had was to go down in the hard rock silver mine, which was unappealing. But he had an uncle named Heine Berger who had won the Nenana Ice Pool some years in the past and had used it to buy 2 coastal freighters that went back and forth between Seattle and Seward, bringing freight and passengers. And Uncle Heine said, well, if you want to work as an assistant cook, you can have free passage, and you can come to Alaska, and maybe there'll be better opportunities there. And so he jumped at that opportunity, and that never left. Once he got there, he was situated. He fairly rapidly, after a series of short-term jobs, got to work with a fellow who had electrical contracts to string power lines through the military bases and up the highway and here and there and everywhere, and learned electrical work, and that's how he made his living. My mother, on the other hand, trained as a school teacher. She taught for a couple of years in Washington State, but it wasn't her vocation. She was restless, and so a couple of school teacher friends of hers were working in a village in Alaska and said, well, we're going to be in Anchorage for the summer, you could come on up and give it a try and see, maybe you'd like it here. And so she did, and then very shortly afterward, met my father. They got married, and again, never left.
Do you think your mom being in education like that, kind of, there was some expectation for you to go to college and
Yeah, definitely so. Well, I did well in school, and there was some expectations all around, my teachers and advisors and so forth. But definitely my mother saw education as the way that, among other things, women gained independence and had, a way to lead their own lives if they chose not to marry and have a family. So, yeah, there was no question I was going to college.
And I'm kind of, before we get you to college, a friend of yours told me that you studied ballet too.
Well, yes, all through, well, actually from the time I was about 4 years old through high school, and even took various classes later on. But yeah, that wasn't my vocation either. It was, well, among other things, the fashion in ballet at that time got to be very long and lean, and definitely not that, so.
I'm thinking back now when you would have gone to college. I'm guessing that there weren't many models of women academics or administrators to kind of encourage you. What was the field like and when you entered? And you were training to be a laboratory chemist, weren't you?
Yeah, I started out as a chemistry major, and there weren't, as far as I can recall, any women faculty members in the chemistry department at University of Washington at that time, but at least none really come to mind. There were some women graduate students, and that was actually good. I saw other people doing chemistry, but also fairly quickly I decided that laboratory chemistry wasn't where I wanted to go, because actually I can remember the exact occasion. I've told this story before. I was, many times actually, but here it goes again. I had an organic chemistry laboratory, and so I was spending, 3 hours every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon in this organic chemistry lab down in the basement of the old chemistry building, which was called Bagley Hall. No ventilation, lots of now banned solvents like benzene, just kind of vaporizing into the lab air, and you could hardly breathe down there. And I got the notion in my head that this was really not how I wanted to spend my life. So I just went down to the Oceanography building and changed my major. Actually, I ended up with a double major, but I had more of a focus in chemical oceanography in my degree.
So when you graduate, you actually go on then to the doctorate program at MIT Woods Hole. Why there, and what was it like for women there?
Well, the Woods Hole was one of the leading institutions in the United States, still is, in terms of that field. I mean, there are several other leading institutions. Certainly, University of Washington is Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and several others. But there was a faculty member, a relatively young one, Jim Murray, at University of Washington when I was an undergraduate student, and he had just finished the MIT WHOI joint program, and he was very eager to recruit other students to it. Me and also my friend Bob Anderson, who graduated the same year, he was talking to us almost every time we saw him about how that was a great program and that was the one I should apply to and enroll in. So,
You didn't like going back east, though, right?
Not particularly, of course, having grown up in a lot of wide open spaces in Alaska. Cape Cod was quite an adjustment, which is where Woods Hole is located. In the winter, not so much. I mean, it's pretty peaceful there in the wintertime, but in the summer, it is just wall-to-wall people. I mean, people coming down to get on the ferries to go out to Nantucket and so forth, and just people milling around everywhere.
Well, and you told me, I think, that it hadn't been the practice of Woods Hole to have women, and it was just a couple of years before your arrival, right? They opened?
The first large number of women, and here I'm talking 4 or 5.
Throngs of them.
To be admitted to the Woods Hole program that happened about 2 years before I was admitted. Woods Hole had long had the attitude that because the oceanography students went to sea on ships with, men crew members and always in the minority, that it wasn't safe and it wasn't appropriate and it wasn't ladylike, and you know all the arguments, I'm sure, for women to be doing this. So, and there were also some that said, well, and there's no use in educating women at the Ph.D. level because they'll just get married and not use the education that they're receiving. But that was an era when the federal government was enforcing some of the equal opportunities and equal rights regulations that had been enacted, and they basically had told Woods Hole that yes, you will be admitting women to your program, and they took that to heart. But still, there was definitely a minority of women in the education programs. There were hardly any women on the faculty. There were a few, I think almost entirely, there were about 1 or 2 in the biology department, I think, at that time. But dozens and dozens of men.
Did you have any mentors?
Oh, sure. And my major professor, John Farrington, was great. He was very supportive of all of his students, but certainly helpful to women in general in the joint program. There were some other faculty, much less so, of course. But basically, it was a great place to go to graduate school. They were very interested in giving students the best possible education by their definition that they could. By their definition was largely independent learning. They encouraged you to, go to the library and read, and to work on your doctoral research. Not very many, there were a few, but not very many organized classes. Their idea was that you learn, and it's not a bad idea, that you learn research by doing it. And if you don't know how to do it, you either ask people, or you go to the library and find out, or and so forth. So it was a learn-as-you-go approach, I guess.
But you got to go to some pretty interesting places, I understand.
Yeah, there were lots of interesting experiences. One I remember particularly came fairly early in my graduate career. I think this was 1977, perhaps. Anyway, there was an opportunity to go out and dive in Alvin, which is a deep submersible. My major professor was originally scheduled to go, and then he couldn't for some conflict. I can't remember what it was, but he sent me. And at that time, I mean, now they launch Alvin off a big ship, like the Atlantis II. But back in the day, they launched Alvin off of a little tender called Lulu. And the story is that Alvin was named for Al Vine, who was the engineer that championed its construction. well, Lulu was Alvine's wife, so that's how the tender, the tender got to be called Lulu. But anyway, the tender was somebody had really had an imagination. It was a catamaran. It had the pontoons were 2 aircraft fuel tanks, and that was the male crew quarters, the mess, and other facilities were down there. The women were housed in a helicopter hut on the deck, chained to the deck, because they couldn't possibly have women and men in the same area. Oh, the horror. And then the pontoons were held together by a metal grill work. And the whole thing was powered by 2 large outboard engines in the back. It was about 100 feet long. And then the sub was chained in the middle, between the pontoons underway, and then launched down through a gap between the pontoons when it was time to dive. Well, anyway, the adventure part of it was when a hurricane headed our way. We were out in the Sargasso Sea, quite a ways offshore. The bad news was that the Lulu could go 6 knots and the hurricane was going faster. So we headed actually out to sea farther at an angle trying to get away. And fortunately we did, because we would have been in a lot of trouble in that craft in a hurricane. But it got into some really heavy weather. So, for example, the helicopter hut was being, washed over by waves, and was quite leaky. So we fled down into the mess and weathered the storm down there. But it was quite a ride anyway. But the 2 best memories of that trip were first when we got up in the morning. The storm had passed. It was crystal clear. It was still a little bit choppy, and there were dolphins playing in the bow wave in front of the pontoons. And we, because it was very low to the water, it was only a few feet above the water surface, and we could crawl out on the pontoons and get within just a few feet of the dolphins jumping in the bow wave. One of them had a little calf that was about that long. Really. And then the other one was when I dove in the Alvin, which incidentally the pressure vessel was a 7-foot diameter titanium sphere. And in that sphere was me, another scientist, and a pilot, so 3 people and a bunch of electronics. Actually,
Pretty constriction.
Yeah. Well, I was told later that the scientist, who was a big guy named Ken Smith, had specifically wanted to dive with me because I was little. So anyway, what they did routinely at that time was to, when the submersible was sank of its own accord, they had heavy steel ballast weights that pulled it down, and then once it got on the bottom, they jettisoned the weights. So they turned off all the power and just let it sink of its own accord. But that meant you could look out through the portholes and see the bioluminescence all the way down, and it was just amazing. At that time I had no idea, but the deep sea below where the light penetrates is just alight with these luminescing organisms. Most of them stationary. It was like a field of stars, but occasionally one would zoom by, and I can particularly remember this shrimp-like animal. Maybe it was a shrimp. It was fairly good size. It was just motoring along, and it had red and yellow patches on it, just going by. And it took several hours, probably close to 4, to get to the bottom, because we were diving in about 2,600 meters of water. So that was quite a show, and I never, didn't ever tire of it at that time. But
Did you ever feel claustrophobic in that?
No, not really. That's not a tendency that I have. They actually test that. They require you to do orientation in the submersible for several hours before they take you on a dive, so that they know if somebody is going to get freaky, or that was their approach.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. I guess that's one of the gifts about being a researcher, is going out in the field. I want to turn, if we could, though, to your academic career. I was talking recently to an attorney who quit practicing in order to teach at the college level, and he said how much more rewarding it is. Now, I know some researchers love teaching, others not so much. How was teaching for you?
Well, I like teaching. It was a challenge to balance various responsibilities. For example, with the research, I would need to go out to sea at specific times. The research vessel uses were scheduled years in advance sometimes, and so if I had to go during the semester, then I'd need to scramble around and find people to substitute for me, and so on. So that balancing all that was challenging, but generally it was quite enjoyable to teach. A little frustrating at times, because sometimes you didn't feel like you were reaching them. Yes, good word. Just not getting through.
Yeah. Okay, not to minimize that teaching part of your career, but I do want to move you to administration. You're here at UAF by this time, and I'm wondering, for some administrators, it comes naturally. Others, it's kind of like pulling teeth. Being the chair of your department is never apparently a sought-after position. But how was it for you making that transition?
Well, the first transition was to be dean of the graduate school, and that one felt pretty natural. It was still involved with education. I had some pretty strong interests in changing a few things for graduate students. A couple of things that I worked on and managed to accomplish were to increase the stipends, the financial allocations to graduate students. They were, at the time that I started, well below the peer average, and really needed to be increased. And then the other thing that I worked on was getting not great health insurance, but some health insurance for graduate students. I had a graduate student who needed surgery during her graduate program, and it was very difficult because, of course, it's expensive. They did have some kind of insurance, but it was marginal, and had encountered a number of graduate students that had really serious problems just because of sometimes not terribly severe health issues, but just big bills piling up and no way to cover them.
It's so interesting because, of course, that was just recently in the last year or two in the news about graduate students unionizing. And, okay, when you get to the university level, there are all sorts of big issues that attraction and retention of students, the financial wherewithal, and so you suddenly have to deal with big issues. What's the atmosphere? What was the atmosphere you experienced, and were there, again, I keep harping on this, but were there other women administrators at that time?
Well, there were some, mostly at the dean level. When I started as graduate dean, there had been a vice chancellor for academic affairs, Janice Reynolds, I think was her name, if I recall, before me, and of course Chancellor Joan Wadlow, who had been chancellor. But the majority of the upper administrators were men. But many of them were, great administrators and very, and supportive of my efforts as well. So I didn't necessarily feel out of place, I guess. But there's still a challenge in women moving up into higher administration. And you look around the country, there are more and more women leading institutions, but still by no means an equal number relative to men. I think the biggest challenge for administrators is to find the right things to work on. I mean, of course, it's not an either or in the sense that there's lots of important problems to work on, lots of important challenges for the university to meet. But choosing the ones where you can make progress, the ones that are important, I think that's the struggle for every administrator.
Well, let's talk about, covering the university for a number of years for KUAC, deferred maintenance. But really, you point out that it's really mostly about getting the maintenance and modernization of the facilities addressed.
Yeah, although the issue has changed over the years somewhat. In the 1990s, when after 1987, and there was a large university budget cut, and the university's resources were really, really limited during that time. Even basic maintenance really suffered during that period of time. I can remember, and Susan can certainly remember, the building where our offices and labs were had big windows up above the main entrance, but they had cracked. And they were worried, of course, that they would fall out and hurt someone, but they couldn't replace them, so instead they fastened chain link fencing across them so that if any shards would come down, they wouldn't hurt anybody. I was grateful, Okay, but moving on, there was a period of time when the university, neglected, out of financial necessity, some pretty important things. But by the time we got into more recent times, the past couple of decades, it is more about what you just said. The actual kind of operational maintenance, the day-to-day, let's fix it, let's make sure it's working okay, is done better. But getting a large chunk of money to do something like replace a power plant that's beyond its design life, or even replace the sewer systems on campus, or in terms of buildings, take a building like Eielson, which is old and not a design triumph even from the start, and turn it, to keep it useful. Hard to find money to do things like that.
Well, and of course, in the 80s, when oil prices dropped and things were so dire for so many people, the university took a huge cut. And so how does one as an administrator ride those choppy waves that come up and come down?
Well, of course, I wasn't an administrator in the 80s. I was right. Still amongst the faculty, but the administrators at the time, at least my impression from the faculty members' perspective, was that they basically kind of hunkered down. They cut what they could cut quickly and with relatively little pushback, which is why maintenance went out the window. Okay, the maintenance budget was just gone because there wasn't going to be any argument from the faculty or the community about that. And that's actually not a bad decision if it was going to just be a few years of trouble. But if it went on for a decade or more, like it did in that time frame, then it, it had pretty serious consequences. And we got to the end of that period, and administrators were, holding up corroded piping and saying that buildings were on the verge of falling down, which didn't help our enrollment at all, incidentally. So I, having made enough not ideal decisions through my life, and both as a faculty member and as an administrator, I don't criticize I try not to criticize anyway people's decisions, because I don't know what went into them. I don't know what was making them, leading them to the decision that they made. But I will say that looking back, if I were in their position then and seeing the outcomes that as it came forward, it probably would have been better to do it a bit differently.
Two things come to mind hearing you talk. Number one, you mentioned student enrollment, and that's always been a challenge, and the university has always attracted a non-traditional student, oftentimes people who work and are older, let's say, returning to the thing. But I also think now with distant courses through the web and whatnot, the landscape must be changed. Would you walk us through a little bit about how in your time you attracted students, kept students, made sure, and then how the playing field has changed?
Well, first of all, I never had the superpower to attract and retain students myself. That was the work of a whole lot of people all across campus, from faculty to advisors to recruiters to financial aid people. So many people had to work together on that. We've certainly, as a university, had our ups and downs. A real nadir was the late 90s with the bad publicity about deferred maintenance, and also, though not incidentally, actually improving employment prospects, because university enrollment tends to correlate with unemployment rate, up when it's high. And when you get full employment, the enrollment will go down. So we're always competing not necessarily with another college to attract students, but with the decision to go to college at all. And if people coming out of high school have a good opportunity for a job, that's where they go. Not 100%, of course, but they tend to go that way. Anyway, but when I was, starting when I was graduate dean, but also involved in some committees looking at changing admission standards and working on improving retention, and then through my years as provost, especially working with Dana Thomas, who was vice provost at that time and had a very big interest and put a lot of effort into retention efforts. We tried to, everything we could think of, to improve retention as one pathway to improving enrollment, because by and large it is less costly to retain a student through improved services and other measures than it is to recruit a whole new one, although that varies. As we used to say, the marginal student is the expensive one. There are some students that will come to you no matter what. They don't have any other options in terms of financially or socially going to another university, and they want to go to a university, so here they are, and they enroll. But there are other students that either are debating in their minds whether to go to college, or they are considering another place. In our case, actually, that's almost always UAA, odds on. But that student who doesn't have their mind made up is more difficult to attract than one that will come here almost automatically. But anyway, the basic truth, though, is when you're trying to improve enrollment, you can make investments in recruiting or you can make investments in retention. And at least initially, investments in retention probably have the big payoff.
You know, one of, talking about programs, one of, I think, the gold stars in your time here was the Ph.D. in Indigenous Studies. And I can't even imagine the hurdles that must be surmounted to get a graduate level program like that in place.
Well, it wasn't all that difficult, in part because there were a lot of people and other resources already in place. UAF, I think, was largely, not 100%, but largely primed to offer that degree. A challenge, though, was that the Board of Regents has always been a bit leery of approving new doctoral programs. They see them as being very expensive, which they can be, of course. And they sometimes feel that resources that the university have should be focused on undergraduate students, community college students, other students, rather than at the doctoral level. But a number of people around the university were wanting to increase doctoral enrollment, and hey, that's come around again, of course, and they're working hard on that. But at the time, one of the challenges was that we really only had, other than in anthropology, we really only had doctoral programs in sciences and engineering, mathematics. We didn't have an English PhD or a sociology PhD or even an education PhD, which comprise a large part of the PhDs that many universities produce. And another challenge was long-term goal of the university was to have more underrepresented minority, but particularly Alaska Native people as faculty members. But at the time, there were very few Alaska Native people with PhDs. There's far more now. But it was very difficult to hire people who were qualified with the PhD in the faculty ranks. So the path through both of those was to have degrees, or at least a degree, that could enroll people who had undergraduate degrees that weren't in STEM fields. Things kind of came together with the Indigenous Studies PhD because we had a lot of resources there. We had the Alaska Native Language Center, we had the Cross-Cultural Studies program, we had faculty in rural development, we had a wide range of research efforts and expertise in various areas related to it. A challenge was kind of coalescing that in a coherent way, though. And we ended up with a program that was interdisciplinary. It had, I think, 4 tracks, if I recall correctly. There was one in education, one in, well, actually, I can't remember all of them now. But anyway, there were a variety of tracks. And it has been quite successful. It got off to a fairly slow start, but the one thing that Brian Brayboy, who was a faculty member in education at that time, was able initially to get a grant from the Andrew Mellon Foundation to offer stipends to students, and then I was able to get it renewed for a second tranche. So having that funding for students to come, that was great, and that caused the program to grow substantially. And also it was always offered with the opportunity to students to either take classes in person or to take them online or even telephonically if we had students out in remote communities. So students did not have to be in residence to participate in the program, and that was another thing that made it popular.
You know, I touched on online courses and how addressing student needs has changed these days. I'm going to ask you at this point, just kind of look in a crystal ball. Yes, that's right. We won't hold it to you if the prophecies don't prove out. But what do you see ahead? What are the challenges for UAF?
Well, there are a lot of things happening in the world, as everyone knows. I think that certainly one of them is that demographics of the United States are changing. There are far fewer traditional age college students looking forward. If as many universities as we have now are going to survive and prosper, they're going to need to have more ways to serve a more diverse student body. I think certainly various forms of distance education are important, and that's already a big effort at UAF, and I think it's standing them in good stead in terms of attracting and retaining students, and also enabling students to complete degrees that they may have started years earlier and then were not able to complete at the original time. And I don't have all the answers of how we can serve a broader range of people, but I do think that that's just a necessity for a vast majority of universities, other than some of the elite ones that still and always probably will have more students applying than they can admit. Another challenge is just the way information is so available now, and of course artificial intelligence, whatever that may be exactly, offers people ways to get information, in case of AI, not always accurate information, kind of at their fingertips. Do they need a university degree to be able to do whatever they need to do in life? How can we make that university experience distinct and important and better than what they could get from Google or any other search engine? I'm not speaking specifically to endorse that one. And again, I don't have the answers here, but I think it's some of the thinking that people need to do. How do we make this something that people feel is worth paying for, and both in terms of their financial resources, but also in terms of their time?
I want to turn in just a second to your personal involvement and loyalty to the school. I mean, working on the flowers, picking up trash is just one example of that, and your willingness to participate. But the idea of higher education is such a long arc in our culture, from the Middle Ages or maybe even back to Plato's Academy. But today, with the advancement of technology and some of the points you outlined, how do we keep that loyalty to alma mater? You know what I'm saying, Susan? Does that, because right outside this building here, we have an object from when this was an agricultural college and school of mines. And yet we're in this high-tech theater right now where you can kibitz with your colleagues or other students around the world. So that personal identity and allure of a school, does that make sense to you, or am I asking it, is that too high up?
Well, I guess I don't have an answer. I think people in the audience could weigh in on this. if, you know, if they were undergraduates at a college or university, I mean, what memories do they treasure from their experience there? What, you know, what makes that experience special to you? I think for many people it was the social experiences, but I don't know. Does anyone else want to speak up?
One-on-one relationships with professors.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, you often hear when I've been able to talk with Neil Davis, for example, there was this romanticism about coming up here and building things from scratch and putting them out in the field. And today you have these remote sensors that kind of let you see huge amounts of data. You know what I'm saying here? But that one-on-one seems to be a key issue.
Right. Yeah, and I, you know, to riff off of what Clark said, I think that, yeah, certainly some of the people that I worked with, both faculty and graduate students, just others involved in the research enterprise, were very memorable. You know, and there were also the field experiences, some of which I described, that were very you know, life-changing in some ways. But a lot of things are changing, and you know, are the traditions that UAF has, I think they still have them, things like Starvation Gulch and so forth. Are those really the things that students are looking for now?
Yeah, it's such a dynamic. Well, let's talk about your commitment. Your friend and fellow chemical oceanographer Susan Sagai and Joan Braddock started picking up trash and tending to the flowers. How did that involvement start?
Well, I think it was largely a way to get together regularly, but also. Yeah, they saw me as a wee bit of a couch potato, or actually a desk potato sitting there.
So it was intervention.
Yeah, yeah. So they wanted to get me out of my office and out in the sunshine, which was great. But I also didn't just want to sit out there on a bench and chat. You know, I like to be doing something when I'm out. So. That was the other part of it.
And you still write reports and contribute that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when asked and sometimes when not asked.
Okay, well, I think my final question is much more personal for me. My son just had twins and I was appalled at how much work. You had 2 sets of twins. How did you manage raising that? I can't even fathom it.
Well, one day at a time.
One day.
You basically, the key is not to look too far forward. Just deal with it. What's in front of you.
Yeah, but remarkable that you did that and still.
Yeah, well, I mean, I many times felt, of course, that they weren't getting enough attention and that other things weren't getting enough attention and that I was spread too thinly, but everything is still.
It turned out okay.
What do you know?
That's right. Well, about this time in the evening, I open it up to the audience to ask questions. We have a ringer with Susan here, who knows you so well.
Yeah.
But does anybody have a question for Susan Henrichs?
When you talked about your experience at Whittle and, you know, very independent, driven learning, it's always been my impression that that's how people learn best,
Mhm.
is when, not through taking all the core classes and all that junk that you're required for 2 years to spend a lot of time and money on.
Mhm.
You know, again, how do you improve the college experience for young people coming in? And how could that be incorporated into undergraduate studies so that students
Sure. Wha- There was quite a push, and I think it's still ongoing, to involve undergraduates in research here at UAF. And I know that my daughter Rebecca participated in that, got involved in a study of torrent ducks in the Andes of Peru, and you know, really found that to be a very transformational experience. And she's just completed her Ph.D. Studying birds, scrub jays in the Channel Islands. And so I think that sort of experience is beneficial. It's, I guess, not accessible to everyone in a lot of ways. Okay, a student like my daughter or many others who have the time and resources to do it, it's wonderful. But her friend, who she's still friends with today, from high school, you know, came from a financially challenged family, had to work 8 hours a day, every day, to make ends meet, and then was taking classes on top of that, and did, through a lot of effort, you know, finish her degree in business, and you know, is quite successful. But still, you know, there's a whole spectrum of people, and I'm not quite sure how to translate those kinds of independent learning experiences to somebody who has so many challenges in life and needs to have a lot of support to get to their learning objectives.
Mm. Anybody else? Well, we'll go with you first and then Michelle.
Michelle first.
Oh.
Question.
No, it's okay, Pablo.
Go for it. All right. If I understood Alexander right, she did a thesis on Lake Smith, which is Home University.
Mm-hmm.
And I would kid her about going from Lake Smith to Lake Woodstock in Antarctica. Big jump.
Mm-hmm.
I know you've been, I don't know if you follow the technology, but as it stands, you can test the water in the river, say, and by the DNA, you can tell what's in it. And a lot of times you think, gee, I didn't know that was here. So has anybody done that to the lakes in Antarctica or the seas that are coming out to find out what the DNA or what's there that we don't even know exists?
Yeah. I would be surprised if they haven't. I know that the technology of looking at DNA in water samples has become far more routine than it was initially, and they can do samples relatively easily. But that's not something I followed in any detail.
You were my best bet.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I bet I could find it, so I'll ask Michelle where you are, and I can look it up.
Okay.
Michelle.
So Susan has been told time and again that we miss her, and situations come up and we say, how would Susan have handled it? And when we needed some information while you were here, your encyclopedic brain would be able to pull up the most obscure things to give us exactly what we needed. But my question to you is this. And we also know that your ego was always in your back pocket and it was never about you. But looking back on your career here, would you give us a couple of things that you're most proud of, that you were part of?
Well, I mean, I am proud of the Indigenous Ph.D., not that it was primarily my effort, but I did, you know, give it nudges and support and help getting through the process as needed. And, you know, it has turned out well. It's been a success, and it's enabled a number of people that probably would have never reached a PhD credential without that program. And I guess the other thing is probably the student success efforts largely spearheaded by Dana through much of the years I was in administration. But the fact that we did get graduation rates for baccalaureates, these are 6-year, full-time freshman baccalaureate graduation rates, above 40% for the first time, up from 30% earlier on. Now, those are not stellar numbers, okay? You look nationally, the average for a flagship institution is probably 70%. But for the students that we admit, the qualifications that they have, it's on par. That is, graduation rate is very much a function of the characteristics of the students that you admit, both financial, their resources, and how well they did in high school. And it's mostly their grades rather than their test scores that you can predict pretty well how well they're going to do in college. When you adjust for that, it was a significant and appropriate improvement in our graduation rates that brought us into the realm that we should have been at before. Now, mind you, still lots of room for improvement, and the pandemic kind of scrambled things a bit. But I'm really hoping to see the day when graduation rates for traditional age students are on par with other leading universities in the United States.
Well, seeing no other questions, there's cake and beverage. Oh,
I had one more question.
sure.
Just because everybody's ready for cake. I have a question, Susan. So I assume that you're still kind of watching the university and watching what's going on and having some opinions on things, and we have some challenges ahead of us. And what if you were to name one thing? What about this place do you think is going to be the thing that really, really helps us through those challenges?
Oh, that one is hard to answer, especially since you said just one thing. And I don't want in any way to downgrade the importance of our undergraduate programs and our graduate programs, because they are the core of any university. You have to have education programs. But the thing that has always distinguished UAF from just a small regional university somewhere in a rural area is the research and the record of not only lots of research dollars, but lots of research publications that are well cited and have brought us a worldwide reputation in certain areas, specifically Arctic research. And I think that the university has to maintain that. I think that that's what makes us special. But working with ever more ways to have that improve and accelerate our graduate and undergraduate programs as well.
Going once, going twice. All right. Yeah, going for the cake. Susan, Henrik, thank you so much for taking time.